Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Good morning. So believe it or not, today I'm looking at trust. Trust in the transition. And it's second in our series, we're looking at transitions, we're looking at trust and faithfulness and other bits. And everything that's said this morning just feeds into everything I've got to bring, which is always great. But as I was preparing for this morning, actually it wasn't part of my preparation. I was watching Lord of the Rings. I don't watch Lord of the Rings to prepare for preaching. But as I was watching it, a scene stuck out to me. And I've seen the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, over 100 times. And I know that because I had it when it came out first on VHS tape. And I watched it so much that I wore the tape out. So I've seen it a lot. But this one time, this one scene stuck out to me, which had never stuck out before. And for those of you who haven't seen Lord of the Rings, it's basically a story of one ring that was built by a guy called Sauron to control the whole world. And after a series of events, it ends up in the hands of a hobbit named Frodo. Now, the ring is so powerful that if Sauron had it, he would destroy the whole world. He'd rule over it. He could do whatever he wanted. And Frodo takes this ring to this place called Rivendell, which is a safe haven, which is led by a guy called Elrond. And this guy calls a council of people to come. And he has all the important people, kings, stewards, a wizard, elves, dwarves, everything you could imagine, to decide what they're going to do with this ring. And one of them says, give me 10,000 men, and I couldn't do what needs to be done. They know it's got to be destroyed, and they know to destroy it, they have to take it into the deepest, darkest part of the enemy territory and throw it into a mountain where it was made. And they were arguing and they're arguing, everyone's shouting over each other. And no one knows what to do. And then this little hobbit, Frodo, who'd carried the ring that far, he stands up and he declares that he will take the ring. That he will take it and he will throw it into the fire and destroy it. And then as he does that, he realizes he doesn't know the way. He knows what he's got to do, but he doesn't know how to get there. And amongst the people there, 8 people step forward and they pledge to protect him and the ring with their life or their death to ensure that it is destroyed. And then those 9 people had utmost trust in each other to carry out this journey into the unknown, into the deadliest, deepest parts of enemy territory, and knowing that the fate of the entire world rests on their shoulders, and that their commitment and their risks that they put their own lives under was for those around them, for those that they loved. And that risk and that undertaking they took, it reminded me of another group in the Bible. It's a group a little bit bigger than that 9, and that's 300 men. And it was 300 men in Gideon, and they undertook that same impossible task and did so with the utmost trust and faith. But before we get into that story, there's some verses far removed from them in the New Testament that I want us to read before we start to look at what they did, and just to keep that in mind as we go forward. So verses in Matthew 17, verse 20. He replied, and he is Jesus here, because you have so little faith, truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. And I just want us to keep that verse in mind as we look at what Gideon and his men did. Because for me, trust and faith often walk hand in hand, and none more so than in this story. So Gideon is found in Judges 6-9, which we're not going to cover all of today. I just want to look at his rise in Israel and then his victory over the Midianites. So as you probably realise, Gideon is an Israelite himself, and he's living at a time when that was not easy. As the Israelites were wont to do in the Old Testament, they'd been unfaithful to God. And because of that, had spent 7 years living under the hands of the Midianites. So it tells us in Judges 6 that the power that the Midianites had over them was so great that the Israelites had to prepare shelters for themselves in the mountain clefts, the caves, and strongholds They were unable to live freely in the open. And whenever they did brave out to try and plant crops or to take their cattle, the Midianites and others would sweep through the country. They would ruin every crop they had planted and kill every single piece of cattle and donkey that they owned. And that when they came and when they did this, they were so numerous that they could not be counted. And finally, after 7 years of this, the Israelites have grown so desperate that they turned back to God and they cried out for his help. They were so desperate for what was happening to them to end that they turned back and they were crying out to God. And God listened and he sent the angel of the Lord to Gideon. Now Gideon at the time, he was using a disguised wine press to thresh wheat. So that's how bad it was that they had it. They couldn't even thresh wheat in the open. He was using the wine press to make it look like he was doing something else. And as he's there, the angel of the Lord meets him and he tells him, you're going to deliver Israel from the Midianites and you're going to free them from their oppressors. Gideon understandably is shocked and straight away doubts what he's been told. He tells the angel, my clan is weak and I'm the least within my family. So in his eyes, he's coming from a bad place, and within that bad place, he's an even worse place. And just like Moses, who came before, when he was told that he was going to save Israel, he could not understand why God would want him to lead the Israelites. In his opinion, he was completely inadequate for the role. He had nothing that qualified him for it, nothing that meant he'd be able to do it. So he asked God to prove that he was indeed talking to an angel. He goes, he creates an altar, and he kills and prepares a young goat, some unleavened bread, and a broth. And as he pours it out on the altar, the angel of the Lord touches it with his staff, and it bursts into flames. And as this happens, and the angel disappears, Gideon knows that he has been face to face with an angel. And after realizing that he was being instructed by God, he did what was asked of him, and he goes into his village, and overnight turns down an altar to Baal, and that causes great unrest and upset amongst the people there. But due to his father and him, nothing then comes of that, or comes to him because of it. But whilst all that is happening, the Midianites are again preparing to sweep through Israel and destroy everything in their path. And as he goes, Gideon gathers an army of 32,000 men to him. But still at that point, he's not convinced that he is the one God has chosen to lead the Israelites to victory. And he asks God to confirm it again. And over the course of 2 nights, he asked the angel to first, he's going to leave a fleece on the threshing floor. And he wants the threshing floor to be wet with dew, and the fleece dry as a bone. And he wakes up the next day, and as you'd expect, the fleece was dry as a bone, and the threshing floor wet with dew. But still, he says, one more night, I want it the opposite. I'll leave the fleece there. I want the fleece to be wet and the ground dry. And unsurprisingly, the same thing happens again that night. And again, Gideon believes that he is the man God has sent, that he is the man God has chosen to deliver Israel out of the hands of Midianites. Now, I want to stop Gideon's story there now for a minute and look at us, because there's lots of parallels between what happened with Gideon and the Israelites and what's happening with us now. We may not be under threat or oppressed. We may not be having people sweep through our lands and steal everything and kill everything we own. But we've come to a place where Marcus and the leadership team are faced with a massive decision of where our future lies. We are being called away from this building to something new. We've been called away from our mountain strongholds and out into the open to face something we haven't seen before. And just with Gideon, the leadership team and Marcus, they've not decided that themselves. They've not placed that decision upon themselves. They've stopped, they've waited, and they've asked God. They've spent days in prayer. They spent fasting and praying. They've asked for prophets to pray and to speak into the future. And we as a congregation have spent a week in prayer and fasting with them as well. And just like Gideon, we don't know still how God is going to deliver us from where we are at the moment. But we know he has promised what he has promised us, and we are certain in what he is going to do, and that it will be good. And the leadership team, they trust God, and they have the utmost faith in what he is going to deliver come January for the church, even though we don't know what it will be. And all the threats and the circumstances may be different to those Gideon faced, but they still stand as an incredible example for us to follow today, for how we can act in trust, how we can act in faith, and how we can move forward not knowing what comes next. And as we go back to Gideon and his army, his 32,000 Israelites gathered with him, and they all want to go to fight to free their land. But God says to Gideon in Judges 7 verse 2, the Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel will boast against me." So God knows, knowing the Israelites, that if they go with 32,000 men and they defeat the Midianites, they think that's their own strength that did it, and not God working in miraculous ways. So he tells Gideon to gather his men and say to all those that are afraid, all those that tremble in fear, that you can leave. And of the 32,000 men that are gathered there, men who just before had been crying out in desperation for God to deliver them, to save them from the Midianites, to free them from their oppressors, 22,000 of them are afraid and turn and leave. They leave 10,000 of their comrades, their fellow countrymen, to fight. And despite the fact that they had been crying out to God to save them, when given the chance, their trust and faith in God evaporated and they left. And as a church and as a congregation, we've spent 5 years praying hard, been worshipping over this land and crying out for God to do great things. And he has. We've seen him do amazing things here. We've seen people give their lives to the Lord in incredible ways. We've seen people make dramatic transformations. And it is not an exaggeration to say that there are people here today that if they'd not come to know the Lord would more likely be dead than alive right now. But still, we're crying out to God and asking him for more, that we want to see him move more, that we want to see him do more, that we want to see Dover overflow with his presence, that we see people saved on the streets, that Dover isn't a down on its luck town, not worth anything and just a gateway to Calais, but be a place full of life and hope and God. And in the coming months, there will be a time when we leave this comfort zone here and we go out, and what comes next, we have no guarantees what that will be. And we know that it's not going to be easier. Unless something miraculous really happens, we're going to be setting up churches on a Sunday morning again, and that's tough and it's hard and it gets up early. And when it gets tough, it's going to be really easy to be like those 22,000, to be crying out to God to see him move, but then to walk away when it gets tough, when it gets put in front of us, that we don't know what's going to come next, to walk away, to not have that trust and faith in God, and just to leave it with the 10,000, hoping that they can do it for you. Because God is going to do mighty things, and every person here will have a part to play in that, and I have absolute trust and faith in that. We had a week of prayer and fasting earlier this month, and some of the bits that came out of that was spoken by God was that we needed to widen our tent pegs, that where we go, we need to go and truly worship God, and that where we go, that we are going to grow. And I know from my own experience that when God speaks like that, then he's going to do mighty things. And I know that from seeing it in my own life, in others around me, but most of all, I know that because we're told that in the Bible. In Isaiah 55, verse 11, it says, "So it is my word that goes forth from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." Those things that have been spoken will come to pass. And just as Gideon had absolute trust and faith in God, because even after he sent the 22,000 away, still God tells him that he has too many. He tells him to send his men down to a stream and to instruct them to drink. And he's to separate his men into two groups. One who bends down to drink from the water, and one who cups the water and drinks it in his hand. And as he separates them, he's left with 300 men. 300 men to defeat an army which was too large to count. An army that had spent 7 years destroying everything that they had. And Gideon, despite all that God has shown him, is still not unsurprisingly afraid. But he is trusting God in everything he is doing. And he still doesn't know how he's going to defeat these Midianites. God's still not told him what comes next and how it's going to happen. So God tells him to go down into the enemy's camp, into the Midianite camp, and to listen to what is being said. And he goes down, and he overhears one soldier tell of a dream where a loaf of barley came rolling down a hill and struck his tent with such force that it overturned and collapsed. And his friend answers in Judges 7, verse 14, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Josiah, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." And after hearing that, Gideon fell down on his knees and worshipped God. And then he returned to the Israelite camp, knowing how they were to defeat the Midianites. So he went and he gave his 300 men, he gave each a trumpet and an empty jar of a torch inside. And he told the men to split into 3 companies of 100, to follow him down into the camp. And once they were there, they must blow their trumpets and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Now this is where, for me, Gideon's story is the most remarkable. Because here we have 300 men, without fear, about to descend into the enemy's camp against the most outrageous of odds. And we know they're not afraid. We already know that the people that are afraid have gone away. They go facing the impossible with no fear in their heart. And despite the odds that they faced, they trusted Gideon. They trusted Gideon with what he was telling them to do. They trusted him with not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone that they knew. And the freedom of their entire country rested on their shoulders. But still they trusted Gideon and what he was being told. And they had the utmost faith in God to deliver them safely. I want to challenge you today to ask, do you have the same faith and trust as those Israelites did? Do you have the same trust in Marcus and the leadership team? That where they are taking us, we're going to see God do great things? Do you have the same faith in God to see those happen? Because we should, and I do. And we believe as a church that Marcus, as a pastor, he's appointed and he's anointed and he's chosen by God. That what he does is done with prayer and consideration and through listening to what God's saying. And seeing how God has moved over the last 5 years, when we have been here, we shouldn't be lacking in any faith as to what God can do. And add into that an advantage that we have that the Israelites didn't, and that's that we have Holy Spirit, that we're able to ask and pray and seek God ourselves, to know and to pray and to trust him in that as well, to go with reassurance in our lives that every day that we walk, that we're not walking alone, that we're walking with Holy Spirit and the power and the joy that comes from relationship with him. Now, Gideon's men had trust and faith, even when their lives and those around them were at the most risk. For us, in comparison, is hardly any risk. There is no reason for us not to have that same trust and faith that they did. And as Gideon led his men down to the edge of the midnight camp, they did everything that was asked of them. They threw down their jars and they smashed them on the ground. They blew their trumpets with every breath they had, and they shouted at the top of their lungs, "A sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon." And as they did, God turned the men of the camp against each other. The Midianites turned to one another in their confusion, and they started to cut down their own people, their own soldiers, their own friends. And Gideon and his 300 men, through their faith in God, saw the impossible happen in front of their very eyes. An entire army, too large to count, turning against itself in confusion and fleeing before 300 men. And then I read those verses from Matthew earlier, where Jesus said that faith like a mustard seed can move mountains. Well, here we have 300 people that had the faith of a mustard seed, and seeing what that can achieve. Their faith in God to do the impossible delivered all of Israel from the hands of their enemies. But to get to that point, they had to trust fully in God and what he was asking Gideon to do. Because when they went down into the enemy camp, they had to act. They had to give their everything. They couldn't go quietly and whisper, "A sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon," and blow a little bit on their trumpets and hope that no one there was going to see them and they'd pass by unnoticed. They had to go into the midst of their enemies, fully trusting and fully committed to what they had been asked to do. They shouted with everything they had. They blew their trumpets with every breath they could manage. And before their eyes, they saw God turn up and do the impossible. And as a church, we're approaching those moments. And it's not long until we're in that same position of trusting what God has asked us to do. And we have to go with that same trust and faith that the Israelites did. And we've heard it this morning, and there's no guarantees that's going to be easy. That where we go after here is going to be comfortable. But we go trusting, and we must go with faith. And when we arrive, just as the Israelites did, that same effort and dedication is needed. And just as the Israelites saw happen before their eyes, I believe that we will see the same. That as we go and as we worship with the same effort and trust and faith that they blew their trumpets, with the same passion and dedication that they declared, a sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon, that as we declare the name of the Lord over this town, and as our actions shine as brightly as their torches did, illuminating God and what he can do, then we will see God do the impossible as well. That he will drive from this land the enemies that oppose him, and that God will do great things in our midst. That God will do great things in our towns and in our lives. That even though, like Gideon and his men, we only be a few hundred, but that as we go forth with trust and with faith, that he is going to do mighty things before our very eyes, that it doesn't just affect us, but it affects everyone around us too, our families, our loved ones, and all those as well. 300 men changed the fate of an entire nation in one day because of their faith and trust in God. And we serve the same God they did. God is the same today as he was then. And he has the same ability to move in miraculous ways. And as we approach the end of the year, we need to show that we have that same faith and trust. 2 weeks ago, we had an amazing baptism service. And the people there, they didn't get baptized to become Christians. They already were Christians. They get baptized to show that publicly that they've made that commitment to God. They do it as an outward sign of their declaration of their faith. And as a church today, I want us to make our own declaration that as a church, we are fully trusting what God has for us through Marcus and the leadership team, wherever they are leading us and wherever that takes us. And that when we go with them, that we go full of faith in God, that he will do great things there. Because that public declaration is important and it is powerful. It shows Marcus and the leadership team that as a church, we trust where they're taking us, where God is calling us, and that we do have faith that God is going to move and do great things. And that every step we take, that God is with us and we will see him move. And not only that, it's a sign for us as well. We see when Moses is in the desert with the Israelites, as he goes up to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments from God, within hours of him being out of sight, the Israelites don't know what to do. They lose all their trust they had, all their faith they have, and they build an altar. So what I want to do, as I hand back to Marcus, as the band comes back up, is I want us to make a public sign and a declaration of the trust we have and the faith that we have. And we're going to have some little envelopes, which I'm going to put on the front here. And inside each one is a tiny little seed. And today's date and that faith is as small as a mustard seed. I want you to take it away with you as a reminder of the trust that you have and the faith that you have in God. But also in those moments, like when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, when we can't see that leadership, when we can't see what's going on around us in the middle of the weeks when we're far removed from church, that we hold on to that trust and the faith that we have in God. And just before I hand back, I want to leave with one final thought. And that's Gideon and his men of 300. We see how God worked through them and the mighty things that he did. Now imagine what could have happened with the 32,000 if the 32,000 people had all had the same faith and they had all stayed and not been sent away. Just how much more could have happened.